We'll do a review of Likutei Sichas in Chelek Yutes. This is the second sicha for the Parshas Shoftim. This sicha, the Rebbe discusses the pasuk that talks about that the Yidden are not supposed to go back to Mitzrayim. The Rebbe will discuss the whole idea. What is the status from Mitzrayim today? We know that the Rambam himself lived in Mitzrayim. And do the Egyptians today, are they included in this mitzvah of not to marry them until the third generation after they convert? And what exactly is how do we define the problem with Egypt? Is it because of the people and, or is it because the land? And the various different aspects, very interesting, as the Rebbe will explain in the sicha. Let's look inside. Eis Aleph, from Pasuk beParshas Seinu, lo yoshiv esa'om Mitzrayim goymer. V'Hashem omer lachem lo yisifun loshu b'derech hazeh oid. The Pasuk says, don't bring back to the people to Egypt. And Hashem told you, don't return to this route again. So from this pasuk, lernt men arois the halacha, we learn the law as ait tor sich nit umkehren, basetzen sich lishtakei Mitzrayim, that a Jew is not permitted to return to settle lishtakei, to settle in Egypt. This applies, it says lishtakei over here, not as a temporary, but to settle there. Unochmer l'shen Chazal, as we find, as in the language of our sages of blessed memory, they say that begimul mekoimes huzuru Yisrael shaloi loshuv eretz Mitzrayim v'chulu, that in three places the Yidden have been warned not to return to the land of Egypt, etc. So this is the halacha about returning to live in Egypt. The Rambam in sein Sefer Yad HaChazokeh, the Rambam in his Sefer of the Yad HaChazokeh, bringt Arov dem Din, he brings down this halacha as metornit veinen in Mitzrayim, that you're not permitted to live in Egypt. Bringt Arov dem Maimer Chazal, and he brings down the above mentioned saying of our sages, blessed memory, that begimul mekoimis is hira Torah v'chulu, that in three places the Torah warned. Und von stimas leshoina is mashma, from the fact the language, from the lack of explanation, but just closing and just saying it in a general way, it appears as that isur is eich da bisman hazeh, that prohibition also applies nowadays. That nowadays there is still a prohibition, and because of that, there's the question, the Mefarshim, how come the Rambam himself and the Riber Gefindman in Mefarshim? And this for we find in the commentaries, a big give and take. How was the Rambam alone himself permitted to live in Egypt? And in general, there were a lot of Jewish communities. So it means because of all these questions and all this debate, means that the prohibition applies today. The Rebbe will ask now, why would there be a prohibition today when we know in the Gemara that Sancheiriv went and mixed the whole world up? So the people that live in Egypt today aren't really Egyptians. So why would we not be allowed to go back to there when the Egyptians are not there? Assuming that the reason we can't go to Egypt because the people there are corrupt, and they may corrupt you as well. That's the reasoning of the Torah. But if it's no more Egyptians there, so, and the Rebbe is going to explain that it has to do not just with the people that live there, but it has to do with the land itself. Let's see inside. So we need to understand beim Isur Chitn mit Mitzri, when there is the prohibition that one is not permitted to marry an Egyptian, and that prohibition applies till the third generation, bis der shlishi, up till the third generation. After the conversion, the Egyptian that converted 3 generations is not allowed to marry into the Jewish community. So the Rambam rules, Paskin the Rambam rules, when Sancherev, the king of Ashur, went up, Bilbel kol ha'umis, he mixed up all the nations, v'irvam zeh b'zeh, he mixed them one with the other, and he exiled them from their place. And therefore, says the Rambam, these Egyptians that are in the land of Egypt now, they are other people, since they have gotten mixed up. Is hotar hakoil. So everything is permissible. Now, a convert, even if an Egyptian, you're allowed to marry them immediately and have to wait 3 generations because we don't know they're Egyptian. He says, because anyone who separates from the Egyptians to convert, so the assumption is that he has separated from the majority. So if an Egyptian comes and he wants to convert and you want to marry him, we're going to say that this person is not really an Egyptian because there is a majority of people that are not Egyptians, and we don't have to worry that this particular person is an Egyptian. It doesn't matter that he's living in Egypt because the one that living in Egypt are not really Egyptians because Cherev has mixed everything up. So the question is, so now that we see that the Rambam himself says that the people in Egypt are not really Egyptians. So, so since nowadays the land of Egypt is a land of other peoples, it's not anymore a land of Egyptians. They do not relate, they do not come from the earlier Egyptians. So why would there be also now, days after Sancherev, the Isur to return in Mitzrayim? The Rebbe will point out later also, in the Rambam itself, it doesn't say any difference. It just says that there is 3 places the Torah says, and the Rambam doesn't say, as the Rebbe mentioned before, that it's also applies today. If the Rambam thinks that because of Sancherev that he came and could mix up the world, so there is no prohibition, so the Rambam shouldn't have just left it by saying that it's not allowed, you're not allowed to go back to Egypt. He should have stipulated that. He should have said that's only applies in the olden days, but now it's okay. So that's what the Rebbe brought out before. So why is there taka no difference? Since with regards to marrying, we say there's not really Egyptians, and since it's another land, so why not? So why not go back there now? We're not going back. Why was we apply the Isser from the Torah when they're not really Egyptians? So the Rebbe is going to say in base that perhaps it's because with returning to Eretz Yisrael, it's not about the Egyptians, it's about the land of Egypt itself. Base. We could have answered, as some of the commentators say, as the Ishur Yeshiva Mitzrayim, that the reason of settling in Egypt is Nitzulib the Dortike mentioned Mitzrim. It's not because of those people, the Egyptians, nor Mitzadam Land Alain. That has to do with just the land itself, the land of Egypt. Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt. Afilu when Mitzrayim is nor der Eretz. Even when Egypt, it's only the land. There's no more Egyptians there because these are new people. But the land of Egypt itself, there's no Egyptians, but Egypt itself is prohibited. So the Rebbe says that this is actually proven, we can actually prove it in the Rambam itself. So sagt der Rebbe, was das ist euch Murchach von Psak v'noisef al zeh von Lashon Rambam. This is also moving evident from the ruling and addition. The language, if we look at the language of the Rambam in the Weiter Dik Halacha, in the next Halacha. So what does the Rambam say? So we see this point that Egypt itself, notwithstanding that there's no Egyptians, there is prohibited. The Rambam says, V'yirali, She'im Kovash Eretz Mitzrayim Melech Yisrael Alpi Bezdin, that if the land of Egypt was conquered by a Jewish king based on the instruction of the court, so then She'im Muteres, then it's permissible, then you can live, then it's okay to live in Egypt. But Lo Yizhira, the Torah did not warn Ela Loshum Lo Yechidim Elishkam Ba V'Biad Akum. The Torah only warned to settle there individuals or to dwell there while it's in the hands of Avodas Chav Mazolas, the hands of the Goy, Mipnei Shemaaseha Mikol Kolim Yoser Mikol Ha'arotzes, because the act of the Egyptians is more degraded, is worse than any of the other lands. Because from them is mashma. What do we see? What it appears from this? As that Isur is mipnei shemaaseho, that the act from Eretz Mitzrayim, the maaseho, unit ma shemaaseyim for the akum, we could call it. The act, meaning we're associating the degrading acts, the kilkulik acts, the bad acts, not to the people, but to the land. It doesn't say there from the Egypt, from the Akum, but we're talking about the Eretz Mitzrayim. How could you say about the land? What a land is inanimate. How do you say a land is Mikul Kolim? And the Rebbe brings an example. Yes, Aderech Maimer Chazal, similar to the saying of our sages of blessed memory. Yesh mayona shemagadlim chulu v'yesh shtufim bezimo. Over there, they say that there are such wells that raise these kind of people. So you drink from those waters that, and v'yesh shtufim bezimo. So we are associating the wells, the water that they drink, to the impact that they have on the people's lives. So there is something about the wells, about the land itself. Und der Riber, and that's why, Obzi is biyad akum, if it's in the hands of Goyim, I feel it need biyad Mitzrayim. Is Masel Mekul Kolim. Rambam says when they're in the hands of the Akum, even if they're other, it's still Mekul Kolim. And you're not allowed to settle there. So we see that the Rambam associates the problem with Egypt not with the people, but rather with the land itself. And the act of the land, even the Akum, not only Egyptians, are the problem when it's conquered by a king of Israel. The mit is move there, tam halacha. Now we understand the reason for this law was davke when Melech Yisrael is kevish eretz Mitzrayim alpi bezdin, only specifically when a Jewish king is conquering the land of Egypt based on the instruction of Bezdin. Megman dan then you're permitted to settle there, because what happens is durch chazak kibush, when you do such a conquering, that Eretz Mitzrayim, so the Eretz, the land of Mitzrayim, becomes Eretz Yisrael l'chol davar. It becomes like Eretz Yisrael for all matters. Those haste, the kibush is poyel ashinu imahus falan. The conquering changes in the essence, causes a change in the essence of the land. And the riber wird bottled is l'shtaker sham. That's why the Isur to settle there is nullified. So the Rebbe learns clearly that in the Rambam, it is very clear that the Isser is not to do with the Egyptians, it has to do with the land. And that's why, as the Rambam's Lashon is, and that's why the ruling is that if you have Goyim there, you can't live there, even though they're not Egyptians. And if you conquer it based on Bezdin, so it changes the essence of the land, then there's no longer a problem and you can settle in Egypt. As the Rebbe points out that the Sefer HaMitzvahs, however, writes, is aber doch nicht glatt. The Rebbe says it's still not so smooth. Because even though the Rebbe argues in the Ha'ara that the Yad HaChazokah is the more conclusive, accepted versus the Sefer HaMitzvahs, but still in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam seems to say over there that the fact that there's Egyptians there who are very corrupt, that's the reason. And so there is that reason as well. So why still do we say that today you can go, that today there's a problem over there when there is no Egyptians? In the Sefer HaMitzvah, the Rambam writes, as the Tama Yisur is that the reason for the prohibition is Sheloi Nilmad Mimaseihem, so that we don't learn from their actions, which means that Yisur is to live nit upland from the Mitzrayim, mentioned from Eretz Mitzrayim, that the prohibition is so that we don't learn from the Egyptians. Those are people, the people from the land of Mitzrayim. So according to that reason, so we need to explain, okay, maybe the land, but according to that reason, Farvos is do that Isur Oich Bizman Hazeh. Why is there the Isur also in that day? Since the people in Egypt now are other people, so there's not Egyptian there. So therefore, the question remains, how do we explain it according to the reason of the Sefer HaMitzvahs, why we're not allowed to go back to Egypt? Okay, so according to the Yad HaChazokah, we explain it because the land itself is problematic, so therefore you can't go back, as the Rebbe said. But according to Sefer HaMitzvahs reasoning, that is because you're learning from their activities, but there's no more Egyptians over there, so why would we not be allowed today? And further, if the problem is because it's such a land that raises terrible people, so even when there is no Egyptians there, is a few events can it sein the Metzies from Nilmad Mimaseihem. So even in the time when there is the facts are that we can't learn from their action, similar to the time when the land of Egypt will be desolate, as it says in Navi Yechezkel, Goimer, Leitavel Boregel Odom, a person will not pass through there. This is in the prophecy of Yechezkel. This is given Bisman Nebuchadnezzar, as it was in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Darf euch sein that Isur betokfei. So the prohibition should still be in its full force. That because it has to do with the so similarly that should be there as well. The Rebbe is going to explain after a lengthy the discussion over here. I mean, who says? I mean, this question is left like the Rebbe says. Yeah, Eib Eretz Magadelas. So then the Rebbe says, so who says no? Who says no? Maybe the reason is betok for them, but apparently the I guess the yaver sobereglon. I need to look. So okay, but maybe that's not a question. That's just a statement that it should apply there too. Yeah, maybe it does, but question, the Rebbe's point is, how are we going to explain it if it's based on the actions of the Egyptians? The Rebbe basically will explain this. The Rebbe will basically answer this, that the Egyptians that do live there, even though Sancheiriv mixed up and there's a minority, but the minority that lives there is still settled, and they do not become bottled. They do not become nullified, and because of that, there are still actually bad Egyptians there as well, while the majority is not, but they don't become nullified in the majority, and therefore there is still an issue, as we'll see. With regards to the prohibition of an Egyptian not being allowed to join the Jewish community, to get married in the Jewish community. Schreibt der Levush, so the Levush writes, that this only applies in the first earlier generation. But today, after Sancheiriv came up, that Sancheiriv removed the Egyptians and he settled others in the place of the Egyptians. So today, it's not the Egyptians. So even though there is still a minority that was left in their places, then it says v'habalei kavua. So that makes them kavua. We know the rule is v'chol kavua kemechza al mechza, that if something is settled, is considered to be like 50-50. The famous example that is the Gemara and the Halacha uses is if you have 9 kosher butcher shops and 1 treif butcher shop in the city. So if you're not sure into which butcher shop you went into, then you're not allowed to eat the meat, because even though the majority is kosher butcher shops, since each of the butcher shops is settled in their place, then we don't assume that you walked into the kosher butcher shop because there's 9 kosher butcher shops, but we say kol kavua is kemechza al mechza, it's 50-50, and the meat would be asur misafik. On the other hand, if the meat was found on the floor in the street outside, so there we say that meat you can eat because it's called the parish, merube parish, that since it's separated from the butcher shops onto outside of the butcher shop, so then it's coming from the majority and you can eat it. That's the rule that we say all the time. Here, when we're talking about the Egyptians that are still settled there, since they're in their home and they're settled, havli kavua, and the chol kavua kemechza mechza domi. So since it's settled, it's considered like 50-50. So why would we allow to marry this non-Jew who converted? Why would you allow to marry them immediately? So this goes beyond what the Rambam explains. The Rambam says, so you're allowed to, but the Levush asked the question, why don't we say that since it is a minority that stayed there, and since it comes from there, it's a kavua, it's kemechza mechza. Says the Rambam, says the Levush, how do you poidish mehem? The one who is converting goes out from the kavua because he's not settled. He's leaving the kviyas and he separates from them. And anybody who separates from the majority. So since he leaves that kavua, this ger that is coming to convert, so it's parish meruba, and the majority is non-Egyptian, and therefore mutar miyad, you don't have to wait 3 generations. Immediately they're permitted to be called. So he articulates in more detail the same idea that the Rambam we quoted before. Lefizeh. So the Rebbe says, so based on this, as miutam nishru b'mekayim oisom, that the minority was left in their places, oich nachon bilbul ha'umais, even after the mix-up of the nations is moved on farvos. Now we understand why why it applies the prohibition against selling Mitzrayim. So lived in Mitzrayim was geblieben in Mitzrayim because of the Egyptians that remained in Mitzrayim. Und welche werden nicht bottle bemüht, who do not nullify, do not become in the minority. But Kohl's man, they seien nicht Polish Liesgeier, because as long that they do not separate themselves to convert, haben sie dem Din von Kavua, so they get the status, the halacha, that they're settled, so they're 50-50. So you're still not allowed to go to Egypt because there are corrupted, 50% corrupted Egyptians, and they're not bottled over there in the road. Okay, but now the Rebbe says that what is the we're saying that he separates from the majority, but that would be if the ger goes and leaves his home to get married. But what happens? The guy remains in his home. He should remain a kavua. And this is going to be the idea that the Rebbe is going to present, that the Pirish means for the concept of gators, not just physically. But first the Rebbe asks, we need to understand, why does the Rambam rule in a across the board? And also the Shulchan Aruch, without making any distinctions. They rule as a ger mitzri is its muter biyad bebas Yisrael, that a ger mitzri is permitted immediately to marry with a Jewish woman, because of the reason that he separates from the majority, and therefore he's assumed not to be an Egyptian. That means that in all situations we have this permitting from the called the parish that everybody who separates is merube parish. So how could we say, give this a blanket, a stam, and say, and all the time, vibald as amid mitzrim zayin geblieben k'meisam. A minority of Egyptians were left in their places. So the Rambam should have made a distinction and interpret this and clarify this. Whether the marriage is in such a way as the ger mitzri is bepoil, that the ger mitzri in actuality pirish, that he moved, which means okar ozil, he uproots, he leaves from zayin bayis, he leaves his home. Was demot is the cloud. Then we have the rule of kol de parish, which is the source for the allowing him to marry, that he's separating from the majority, or that there is nitos from zayin bayis, or it's a case where he's not leaving his home. Was demot hoter dem din from kavua. Then he has the law that he's permanent over there, which is kimachzal machzadami. And therefore, you shouldn't be able to just marry him if he stays in his home, if he remains there, because he becomes a kavua. Al derech v'b'inyan dugmosei, similar, we find a similar situation. The Gemara zogt in Ksubas. The Gemara in Ksubas says, V'Rashi and Toysus and dort masbir. And Rashi and Toysus explain over there, as their din from kol de porish is dafke when their boyel is porish from zabayis. That the din of kol de porish is only when the person that his boyel is actually leaves his home. So this idea that it has to be not in the house, because otherwise it would be called the if he remains home, we don't say called the parish. So this idea that the Rebbe is suggesting over here, that depending on how you're allowed to marry this Egyptian, this person that lives in Egypt, we're only going to assume that called the Parish Beruba Parish if you're not in this house, but only if he physically leaves it, Okar v'Ozil, but not if he's in his home. So how come the Rambam is not Mechalik Zayin? But the Rebbe says, but Pashtus Kemen Zogan, simply one can say, at the time that he converted, he needed to separate from his home. He physically needed to move. Stay out, go out of his house. The one who converts separates from them. He has to physically leave in order to convert. But that's not sufficient. So the Rebbe explains, just leaving his house, the Rebbe is going to argue, the Rebbe is going to question, would not constitute in Egypt leaving your place, Parish Beruba, you'd have to leave all of Egypt, that the Rebbe is going to pluruv and ois dalet. But those in it masping, in the case of Egypt, when called the Parish, it's not enough for him to leave his house to be Megayer. He has to leave all of Egypt. He's nid genug dovus that he's Parish Mebesei, but a Dav Zayin Parish is not sufficient that he's separating from his house. He needs to separate from Gan Eretz Mitzrayim, from the entire land of Egypt. Ubahagdim, as the Rebbe is going to bring out, that the whole Parisha, just being in the land of Mitzrayim itself, as far as the marriage of an Egyptian, is not because they're just in their home. Their 50-50 is just because they're in the land of Egypt, as the Rebbe will point out. So the bottom line is, while the Levush explains that the reason one can marry immediately is because called the Parish, Meruba Parish, and since he's going to be Megayer, but how does this help the fact that the person is still in Egypt? That seems that he would still be a mechza, and we shouldn't be allowed because of that. The Rebbe is going to explain now why it seems like he should have to leave Egypt in order to be qualified for kol the Parish, Meruba Parish. Dalet, the Gemara zokt in Yebomis. The Gemara says, "Ovet kechavim shekidush zman hazeh." A non-Jew who gives kiddushin to a Jewish woman. Now the choshim likiddushin, we worry about the kiddushin. Shema ma'aseres hashvatim. Maybe this person, maybe he's not a goy. Maybe he is from the 10 tribes, and he's Jewish, and the kiddushin is a good kiddushin. Frag the Gemara. So the Gemara asks a question: why would you worry about that he is a Jew? But he's a Jew, is a minority, and called the Parish, Meruba Parish. But anybody who goes away comes from the majority. So this guy who stepped forward here must be a guy because he is from the majority. The majority are guy. Entfer the Gemara bedukta dikvi. That we're talking about in a case where the 10 shvatim are set. So since they're kvi, they're not anymore. We don't say kol the parish meruba parish. It's kimachza mechza. Dukta kvi. Rabbi Kana said, where are the kvi, the seres hashvatim? Says vayanchem. The pasuk says the chalach, the chaver, the goymer. That's the pasuk in Malachim Beis that the seres hashvatim were brought it over there. So in those places, since it is kvi, so therefore we're not going to say that they come from the majority, and that's why Choshev the Kiddushin. Rashi says, "Bedukta dikvi," and there said the Bnei Aseres Hashvatim, the 10 tribes are kvis over there. They're settled there in Chalach and Chaver. V'chol kavu k'mechza mechza dami. Anything that is settled is mechza mechza. V'echi kvi, where they settle, k'diksiv v'inochem b'chalach b'chaver. So that's why they are kvi over there. So Toysus argues So that would be the beduchtayu have a ruba maseres hashvatim. Tosfos doesn't say. Tosfos says that when the Gemara says beduchtayu, over there is actually the majority are Yidden. The majority are from the 10 Shoftim. That's the reason. Not because of the reason that Rashi says that it's going to be a kavua, kemechza mechza, but the reason why you're chodesh l'kedushin, because the Jews are actually a majority over there in that places. Not like Rashi explains, that every time when it's settled, that wouldn't be a good reason. Because why? The ozil ihu ligabo, because if he went to her to marry her, in other words, that he was Peidish, what does it help me that there is a seres hashvatim that a kvi over there? It's kimechza mechza. But if he goes to her, called the parish meruva parish, it's not going to be kviyas because he separates from the majority. So even if there are settled aseres hashvatim, it's not 50-50 because he goes to marry her. As we say in the end of Ksubas, they're called the parish meruva parish. So the language the Rebbe says in the Gemara, beduchta dikvi, is mashma like Rashi. This is moving from what Rashi will need learn and be Tosfos. It's understood why Rashi doesn't want to learn like Tosfos, kvi, that it means that there's a majority of aseres hashvatim. Agam as Rashi Alein is mefarish in Masechet Ksubas Canal. Rashi agrees and explains Masechet Ksubas, as it says, as Okar haboyel mebeisoi hotadin from called the Parish Chulu, that it does have the din, so called the Parish Meruba. So, how does Rashi? Why does Rashi say that it's kavua kemechza mechza? But Rashi doesn't want to learn like Tosfos, but late Tosfos is kosher the Loshna Gemara, because according to Tosfos that there's a majority. So why does he say beduchta the kvi? Why is the Gemara saying that they're set over there? Esod gedarft stein beduchta deruba. We should say there's a majority over there, not the kvi. A kvi comes out that they're not the majority, but it's because the kavua. From Loshen beduchta dikviya is muchach. From the language of beduchta dikviya is evident. That we're talking about the din of kavua. But we still have the problem, Tosfos' argument, that called the parish meruva parish. So, okay, the Gemara tells us that we're talking about kviya, but the question is, how is it kviya? But Okar Abal, as the Rebbe brings, the Rashi says, there's more in there. The Baal, their posik zogt by Yanchim b'chol v'goyim. The posik says that they settled over there. That place has become the set place of the 10 tribes. Und der Far is their kvias nit bagrenet their bottom. So that's why their being kavua is not limited to their homes. But this is the whole entire place of them. As Kozman they finden sich dorten, as long whether they go out from their house or don't go out from the house, doesn't make a difference. They're still kavua. They are still considered settled even when they're settled from their home. So, while it's true when the boyel goes from his house, it's called the parish, meruba parish. That is true. Rashi says that. But as far as the Seres HaShvotim, their place, because the pasuk says, is not their homes. Their place is Chelek. That's their kviyas. As Kozman ze gefinnen sich dort, haben sie adin von kavua. They're considered kavua. Afil of es eine perish even when they leave their house. Damit is move on. Was Rashi's Messiah Now we also understand why Rashi concludes, where this why l'chayre was the Rashi meisuf of them or state finishing Gemara gleich noch there? What is Rashi adding here? The Gemara says that they live there. Why is Rashi bringing it? Nor the mitzvahs are masbir. That's how we explain. How come that the people from there that are mekadesh even if they have left their homes, especially that's the common places to be mekadesh, not in the house but living in the house. That they make a home for marriage for their children, which means it's out of them. They're Polish. They're still kavua. So Rashi explains it. Where the kvi? That makes them a kavua. Like them, we need the dan. So according to this, in our case, when we talk about the Egyptian, the Baal there is surbashteito them was a mitzri. The prohibition is because he's an Egyptian. Darf auskommen as sein kvies is in ganzen Land Mitzrayim. That all of Egypt should make him settle, whether he is at home or not at home. Kolzman is nit arois from Gvul Mitzrayim, as long as he hadn't left the boundaries of Egypt, even when he separates from his home. Otter dem din von kavua k'mechtzal mechtzal is still going to be kavua k'mechtzal mechtzal. So basically, certainly according to Rashi, we have a problem. Why an Egyptian can marry, since the Lavush says that there is miyut over there, there's some Egyptians left over there. And those that were left over there are considered kavua as long as they're in Egypt. So what is the Lavush says they're Polish Gayer? Doesn't help him if they're still in Egypt. So that should still be applied, the prohibition of not being allowed to marry an Egyptian up to 3 generations. Why can he marry? Why we allow him to marry right away? Because the fact that he is in Egypt. But the Rebbe goes further. This is Rashi. The Rebbe, even Tosfos, who disagrees with Rashi, and he says that called the Parish while you will be Daseres Hashvotim when they're in if they go out from their home, they will go by the majority. We'll say called the Parish Beruba Parish, and that's why Tosfos learns that the Gemara means Kviv, that means that the majority are Saris Hashvotim, so they're actually the majority, and that's why we have to worry about their Kiddushin in their places. So the Rebbe says that by Egypt, Tosfos will also agree that as long as in Egypt, to the Rebbe's Svara, the Tosfos may agree that it's still considered to be Kavua. This that Tosfos does not accept this idea that it's Kavua, even though he is Polish while they're in the place of the Aseres Hashvotim in Chalchol and Chover. He says, Davke b'negei dem fall from Aseres Hashvotim. This is only as far as the case of the 10 tribes. Das ist der Fall, weil sie gefunden sich in jener Erter hat nicht gescheiches zum Etzem Inyan HaKadoshim, is because the reason they are in that places is not connected to the Kiddushin, so it doesn't make it not Porish Beruba. That would be Porish Beruba, and that would not require a Choshen the Kiddushin in that case. But Mashenkin in unser Fall, as opposed to in our case, was there is to love a bekoil kumt. The reason why he's not allowed to come to marry is Valer a Mitzri from Eretz Mitzrayim, is because he's an Egypt from land of Egypt. But euch Tosfos halten, Tosfos will also agree, as Kol's man gefindt sich in the Gevulim from Eretz Mitzrayim, as long as the Egyptian is in the boundaries in the land of Egypt, Hataradin from kavua is still considered kavua. Lagabedem isur fun mitzri, as far as the isur of marrying a mitzri is still a kavua. The fact that he's in his house or not his house. So therefore, pikol anal is under kushla dichta. So based on all the above, that you have to actually leave Egypt. So how come one could marry a woman from Egypt right away? What do we say called the Parish Meruba Parish? It's not, he didn't leave Egypt. The Baal designing believe Mitzrim and that it's Mitzrayim. Since the Egyptians were left in the land of Egypt, no, they had to love it because these vile called the Parish Chulu. And the reason why we're allowing it, as the Rambam and the Lavush explained, it is because called the Parish Chulu, because it separates from the majority. So the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch should have made a distinction between Ager versus Arois from Eretz Mitzrayim, between Ager that left Egypt land was Shoftim did from called the Parish, which gets the halacha that he's somebody that has separated. When Ager in Eretz Mitzrayim and Ager which is in the land of Mitzrayim was Shoftim din from Kavua, and is also Mr. Shlishi. He has considered to be Kavua, and therefore he should be Asur until this third generation. Okay, so why does the Rambam paskin? Why does the Shulchan Aruch paskin that in Egypt you can just marry an Egyptian because it's Meruba Parish that he's probably not an Egyptian, when if you're in the land of Egypt it should be still Kavua. So the Rebbe says, hey, those verstehen behagdim aggressive to me in the minyan will understand it by introducing an even greater surprise in this subject matter. Wie es fragt, that Aruch HaShulchan. The question asked by the Aruch HaShulchan. The Gemara zogt in Nazir. The Gemara in Nazir states, as a isha is loinaidi, a woman does not move. And the reason is the whole kavod of Asmelech Prima in Bais. The honor of a daughter of a king is inside, is in the house. On the river Hotzi Adin from Kavua. And therefore, woman is considered to be Kavua, not moving. And this is the Gemara Mamshich. So the Gemara continues and says, V'chi teimo hochanami nayit. Eimo b'shuka ashkar v'kodesh. Maybe also in this case she moved because maybe she wasn't home at the time. He found her in the street, in the market, and it was Mekadesh over there. Who said it was in the house? And the Gemara answers, Hoda som hodra linuchusa. She goes back to where she is while she's moving now, but she's going back to the haste, which means Hafilu venzi is parish mebesa. Even when she is separated, she's not at home. Beshuka ashkach, he finds her in the market. The bald ober. Since, however, she goes back to her settled place. As the Gemara says, so then she is considered to be kavua, even though temporarily in the shukah, that doesn't make her not kvius, and she's considered kavua. So how could you say in our case, called the Parish Chulu, even if he separates to get married to the Israelis, he's still considered settled. Why would that be okay? The explanation of the Rambam and the Lavush that this is a Parish because he goes out to get married, but he's still considered kavua. If he goes back home later on, so the fact that right now he's not makom kaviyus is not considered to be parish meruba. He should have a din of kavua. So why is you allowed to marry right away without waiting 3 generations? The Rebbe is going to bring out now that the porish is not the physical porish, but it is the idea that is going to convert. That makes the idea of porish. The Birbaze is moving from Diuk Losh to Rambam. It's the precise language that the Rambam uses. That anyone who separates to convert has so then the assumption that he has separated from the Rav. It's not the fact that physically he moved, but he went to be Mizgayer. Was is the Rambam Moisim with the word Lizgayer? What does the Rambam add with the word Lizgayer? Nochmer. Even if he's not separated to this guy, for whatever reason, he just left his home. Now he's a kola perish, meruba perish. Or the meat is the Rambam maasbir. But with this, the Rambam explains at the taich from perish do is not kipshute. That over here, the meaning is separated is not literally perish b'mokim. We're not talking about that he's separated physically from the place, nor their mid kufa. But this itself was the fact that he's converting heister porish. That is called that he's separated. Basically, what it means like this: together from porish can zayin tzveyafanim. The definition of separating can be in two ways. Aleph in mokim gashmi. First off, it could be in physical place. At his porish from a mokim kum tzatzoit mokim. He leaves one place, comes to another place. And he doesn't go back to his place, so that is considered porish. That's one porish. And as far as the Rebbe argued before, in order to be porish memokim in Egypt, that would need you to go all the ways outside of Egypt, the Rebbe's arguing. But then we have a second level of porish. Beis in matzav, that is standing. In Zaimokim bedin ha-Torah, in his standing in this place as the Torah view. Zayin mitzias in Torah. How Torah looks at his existence. At his porish from ein matzav, he separates from one condition, from one situation, on geht river and he goes over into a second. Like in our case, was at his porish from friedrich matzav vidin, that he's separating himself from his previous standing. And halacha als eine Yehudi Mitzri, he was non-Jew, he was a Mitzri, und stellt sich über durch Geiris in an ander Matzav, and he transforms himself through the conversion into a different situation. Und der Riber is done nicht shaykh hodrol lenechusa. Therefore, over here it doesn't apply that he goes back lenechusa, that he goes back home or anything else, because he bowed. As the Aruch HaShulchan asks, because he's not going back, because it's not the physical movement. Since this separation is that he is converting, so after that, it doesn't apply to return. That's why the Rambam usually is Gayer. It's a condition that he changes, and it doesn't matter that he goes back. And that's why the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch rule. That Ager Mitzri is permitted in Basrael in Alefan. Even when he finds himself in Egypt, he is in Egypt, all of Egypt, doesn't matter. And even if he doesn't move from his house, he's standing, he's in his house. Not like the Levush brings down that called the porish, meruba porish. Oh, yeah, like the levush, meaning the levush is also going to follow the loshon of the Rambam. We're going to say that it's the li's gayer. But on durch dem gufa vasaris megayer is a porish. Through that itself, that he was megayer is a porish. Just look at the loshon of the levush. How to perish, man. This is the same lotion as the Rambam, that it's porish. The Rambam brings down same thing. The wush with lotion Rambam, same. The prisha here is the condition. So when the levush uses the lotion of Kol the Porish is talking about the situation in concept. He's in din of Torah. He's no longer an any Yehudi, becomes a Yehudi. And there's no going back, so there's no problem with the Aruch HaShulchan's question. As opposed to the other Egyptians that remained in Mitzrayim. Even though they're a minority, they're still considered settled. Und der Riber bleibt zu lieb sei, and because of their kviyas remains the Isur zu besetz sich in Eretz Mitzrayim, that we can't sell Mitzrayim shalim masei b'cholu. So that's what we can't learn from their action, that even according to the Sefer HaMitzvahs, who says that the Isur has to do from learning from them, but they're like 50% from those that are kavua. Befrat, Ados Azamet sees this is such a entity, the Egyptians that are there. You can say that it at all. It doesn't really apply. It doesn't really make sense to say as they're mute. So bottle that minority should become nullified beroiv. Sai mitzad the mute and sai mitzad the because of both aspects that we can't really say that should be bottled. While Aleph sees a mute in kamus because it's a minority in quantity, so mentioned. So there may be less people, but do is there is nor mitzad eichos. But here we're talking about the quality, kilkul maaseyim. The problem is because their actions are bad, are ruined. Is mitzad ribuy goydola eichos. So because there is the great and the big quality, is as alderef adover choshus vertnik bottle. So then it becomes like an important item that doesn't become bottle. So because they're so evil and they're so mekulkol, so even their minority doesn't become bottle. That's from the perspective of the minority, and the perspective of the majority. Bei do is the roiv, the mention von andere umes was gefindet sich in Mitzrayim. This majority, which is the other people, the Mitzrayim, nit menaget zu midum avatle. They do not oppose. They may not be as corrupt, but they don't really oppose the minority mevatlim. Warum euch die umazane mekulkol, because they are also mekulkol. They're also wrong. As his mernit was the Mitzrim zayin noch mer mekulkol. They're greater. They're more ruined. Und der mit, the river is the Metzias from the Roif, the existence of the fact that we have a majority, nit bekoyach zum battle sein der miut, it can't nullify the minority from the Mitzri. So basically, even if the reason is the land, that's one thing. That seems like in the Yad HaChazok of the Rambam. Can't go back there. Even if the reason is, as Sefer HaMitzvahs, that the actions are corrupt of the Egyptians, that remains today because as long as they are a minority, as long as they're in Egypt, they are kavua, and either way, they would be considered mechza mechza. And as the Rebbe points out, especially we don't have real abitul beroiv from the majority's perspective, because the goyim are also corrupt, so they're not, and the minority expected because there's an eichus, so it doesn't get bought. Zayin. Apia now, based on the above, as in Eretz Mitzrayim, so nachalz faran from the Mitzrayim from Amol. Based on the above, that in Egypt there is still left over the Egyptian from above. So this brings an additional encouragement and arousal in avodas Hashem b'yimeinu elu, in the service of Hashem in our days. So behagdim, by introducing Hagam as alin yonim from Torah, although that all aspects of Torah gain naraynim klal are included in the rule from HaTorah in Yitzchis, the Torah is eternal. If Allah's manim and Allah mekoymas, all times and in all places. From deswegen is the achiluk, yet there is a difference between yonim between those matters of mekanish mekayim zayin kipshutim. Some things you cannot fulfill literally. When the nitzche zayda is beruchnis yonyonim, and then we have to say that they are eternal. It's only in the spiritual aspect. They're not physically internal because we cannot do them today. We cannot fulfill them literally. And then there is a difference with those things, and also those matters that even today we have, it's physical, it's tangible. But it does beweist, because this proves as the inyonim, and is the nitzchis noch mit aggressor and taken, that shows that the eternity in these items is even with more force. It drückt sich aus, because it expresses itself. In Olam Hazagashmi Leinu Kol Ha'amim. This is also expressed in this physical world to the eyes of all the nations. Same thing in our matter is that we can bring this out, that it is in the very literal sense. State in Pasik, the Pasik says, Atem re'isam asher osisi l'Mitzrayim. You saw what I've done to the Egyptian women. V'ato shemoya tishmu b'koili. If you will listen to my voice, ushmartim, you'll hearken to Hashem, ushmartim as brisi, and you'll guard my covenant, v'yisam l'izgulim v'kol ha'amim. You'll be a special from all the nations. Mamlechas kohanim v'kodesh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. From them is move on. So from this understand, you saw what is done to Egypt. The Rebbe is talking that this was after the 6-day war, and where the Egyptians got a terrible defeat. They were destroyed by the Yidden. So that what we read in the pasuk, you saw what happened to the Egyptian. And then the pasuk says, "Is achona to the inyonim v'chashtein in the psukim la'achar which are written in the verses that follow. V'avi eschem elai, I bring you to me. V'atim shemoya tishmu. Now, if you listen, ushmartem as bris, you'll keep my kavias, and this going to be. This is, you'll be a special nation to me. This is all an encouragement. This is happening now. This is something real. The Rebbe was explaining then after the 6-day war. When Eden zen be'einei basar. When we see the Eden see with eyes of flesh, with the Eibishter weist for sei nisim, how Hashem shows miracles by oprechen and zich, va'oinish v'chulu, by taking the accounting and punishing the nations, who oppress, make it difficult for the Yidden. Das als is murdered Eden. This brings about encouragement, wakes up, arouses the Eden, as his own verstarken their bris mit Neibishtim, that they should strengthen their covenant with Hashem, that you should listen to my voice. From this we also understand, as when Eden zen with the Eibishter, rechnet sich ab mit Eretz Mitzrayim. They see how Hashem is taking his accounting with the land of Egypt. Over there, there are still the same Egyptians like used to be. So once again, physically, it repeats Leinei Basar. In the eyes of flesh, you see what I've done to Egypt. Like it was the first time. By the Eden. This should therefore bring out by the Eden that see what I've done to Egypt. An additional arousal. That you should listen to my voice and keep my covenant. The Yidden should strengthen themselves in their observance of Torah mitzvahs. We should act like a special nation, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This becomes the close preparation to the Bekoyle Tishmo, to listening to Hashem's, was bring them Hayoim in Bekoyle Tishmo, brings about that today, when this the Eibishter are going to redeem us, Hayoim, today, when Bekoyle Tishmo, that Hayom from Beis Mashiach, the day of the coming of Mashiach, Kavtochas Mashiach Tzidkenu. Mashiach said, he says, Mashiach, when do you come? So he said, Hayom. So he says, but it's not true. So because he didn't come, he said, Hayom B'Kel D'Shmo. That was promised by Mashiach Tzidkenu. B'Korev Mamish, very soon. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Bahaloischa Tov Shin Chov Zayin.